In this video, Magnus Carlsen destroys Alexey Shirov in one of the most unbelievable games you will see all year. Now, if you like Magnus Carlsen or wild attacking chess, then you gotta watch this video until the end to see how it all plays out, because this game is just freaking wild. In the game, Alexey opens 1e4 and then Magnus goes for a Najdorf Sicilian. This is already a little bit of a surprise. I mean, Magnus is not really a Najdorf player. Of course, the Najdorf being characterized by the move 6, a6, getting that pawn into the game. Now, Magnus does not like this move from black because it is so theoretical. There are just so many different moves you have to know, so many lines and variations. However, this is a titled Tuesday game on chess.com. Magnus thought, what the hell, it's a blitz game. Let's see what happens with the Najdorf. But if you know anything about Magnus Carlsen, you know he's going to mix it up this game, and that is exactly what he does. On move 8, he does not play the standard move b5. Oh no, instead of that, he goes h5. Alpha Zero has entered the chat. Okay, this move in this line is just freaking wild. The idea is you want to clamp down on the g4 square, stopping white from going g2 to g4. Of course, in the main line, black goes b5, and then white usually follows up with queen d2, and then after knight b to d7, he goes g4. The idea is to go g4 to g5, trying to gain space on the king side, then launch your pawns down the board and get an attack going. However, in this line with h5, going g4 is just suicide. It's not an option. But there is a drawback to this. Here, Magnus Carlsen cannot really castle because that h5 move just weakens his king side so much. So on one hand, you do stop white's attack, but on the other hand, your king is just stuck in the middle of the board for like an eternity. Now, this is a very interesting choice from Magnus because Alexey Shirov is known to be a wild attacking player. So let's see what Alexey comes up with. In the game, he goes queen d2, and then after b5, he actually changes plans and goes bishop e2. What's the idea behind this move? Well, normally white wants to go castles long here. However, here black has already blocked off the attack with the h-pawn, and now black has a very easy way to get an attack going with things like b4 and d5, gaining space in the center and on the queen side. So instead of that, Alexey says, hang on a minute, you already weakened your king side with h5. I'm just going to castle on the king side, and then I'm going to play more of a slow positional game. I have the very solid pawn center. Your pawns on b5 and a6 might end up being a weakness. And that pawn on h5, what is it doing if I don't castle queenside? I mean, here Alexey's not exactly trying to go g2 to g4. So both sides playing these weird Jedi mind tricks with each other. And here Magnus knight b to d7. This is the standard idea in this line. And now Alexey has to find the right move, but already he is showing why he is just not on the same level as Magnus freaking Carlsen. The best move here is actually b2 to b4. Now this move looks a little bit weird. Why are you going b2 to b4 in the Najdorf? Well, the idea is you want to go a2 to a4, but you want to stop black from going b5 to b4 in response. So the main computer line here goes bishop e7, then you go a4, take back with the rook, and suddenly white has a really good game. The rook on f1 is coming to a1, and despite starting out as a Najdorf, this has become sort of a hedgehog style position. Of course, the hedgehog being characterized by pawns on a6, b6, d6, e6. And no, before you give me crap in the comment section, no, there's not a pawn on b6. However, this is starting to look like a hedgehog style position, and Alexey would have a fantastic position against Magnus. But of course, that is not what happened. Instead of the move b4, Alexey went straight for a4. Now, if Magnus went b takes a4, that would just justify Alexey's idea. Here, Alexey takes back with the rook and then goes rook f to a1 with a fantastic position. But instead of that, Magnus, being the very stable chess genius that he is, he finds the key idea, b4, hitting the knight. Now, this is a double-edged move. The pawn on b4 is going to be a little bit weak. However, it gains space on the queen side, and it does kick away the knight on c3 back to a weird square. In the game, Alexey goes knight to a2. This is the best square. If you go something like knight d1, then simply d5 is incredibly strong. So instead of that, knight a2 on the board. This is the typical retreat square in this line. But now again, d5 from Magnus Carlsen. Magnus just does not care if he loses the b4 pawn because he's taking on e4, and now taking back on e4 as white is suicide. Magnus jumps in with the knight, and that is just terrible for white. Instead, Alexey has to live with this pawn on e4 for now. So white doesn't want to take. Black also doesn't want to take, because then Alexey goes knight to f3 with a really good square for the knight. So we get this weird little dance, and Alexey starts with the move c3. Now, this is a very human-looking move. He's just bolstering these knights on the b4 and d4 squares. Of course, knights always need homes. They need good squares to sit on. However, this just hands over the initiative to Magnus Carlsen. That is not something you ever want to do. Instead of c3, the computer finds the really strong move, knight to c6. Wow. All right. If Magnus here takes the knight, then Alexey takes back with a dominant position. You don't want to do that. Instead, Alexey would go queen c7. Now the knight is being hit twice. But then you go knight to a5. And this looks completely insane, but the knight is hitting the bishop. And white is actually doing okay here. Instead of that c3 on the board, again, very solid move, just a little bit passive, and it gives Magnus the chance to take over the game immediately. So how does he do it? Well, he starts queen c7. This is the best square in general for the queen. And Magnus wants to follow up bishop d6 when the queen and the bishop are just slicing through to the king side. I mean, already we're starting to see Magnus's master plan come together. The bishop on b7 slicing through the board, the queen and the bishop doing a similar thing, and of course the alpha 0 pawn on h5. That is in prime position to go down h4 to h3. And I don't want to spoil it for you, but that might be what happens in a few moves. So stick around. All right, now Alexey Shirov goes rook a to d1. I mean, this move could not look more obvious, but here the computer has the insane looking idea a4 to a5. Now, if you understand why white is supposed to play this move, let me know in the comment section below. It's honestly not that easy to figure out, even with Stockfish right in front of me showing me all the variations. The main idea is white doesn't really have a good waiting move. However, this a4 to a5 does gain space on the queen side. It prevents a5 from black. And it also gains control of the b6 square, which means ideas like knight b6 are out. And also in the future, the bishop might come to the b6 square in some variations. And of course, if you want to go a5, you need the rook on the a1 square to support it. So overall, a5 would have been the move, but rook a to d1, I mean, what could possibly look more natural than that? However, now Magnus Carlsen channels alpha 0 energy. He throws the h-pawn down the board, and we have an attack going. Oh boy. Now here, Alexey has to go h3 to stop that pawn. That pawn is just too dangerous. I mean, yes, it does look scary. You do give up the dark squares on the king side. However, it is just necessary to stop that pawn at all costs. Of course, if you don't stop the pawn, Magnus Carlsen's idea is just h3. Then the pawn becomes an absolute menace, whether or not Alexey Shirov takes it or goes g3. Okay, in the game, rook a to d1, then h4, and then f takes e4 from Alexey Shirov instead of the move h2 to h3. Now, this move is effectively suicide. Magnus is going to have some sort of sacrifice coming very soon. Now, of course, Magnus takes the pawn with the knight, hitting the queen. The queen has to go somewhere. In the game, Alexey Shirov retreats to the e1 square. Now, bishop d6. Oh boy, you can just see every single piece joining the attack, no matter where it is. Of course, the knight comes to f6, the rook on h8 supporting the alpha 0 pawn. This is just ugly for white. Now, you gotta give credit to Alexey Shirov here. He does find the best defensive move. That is knight to f3. It is already too late to play the move h3, and here's why. Black simply goes bishop h2 check. Then after king h1, you go knight to g3. And now white already has to sacrifice the queen against Magnus just to stay alive. If you don't do that and go king takes h2, oh, that is bad. Knight takes the rook, king retreats, queen h2 check, and then checkmate on the g2 square. So h3, a good idea, move prior, but here, absolute suicide. So hats off to Alexey finding knight f3. But now alpha 0 enters the chat for real. h3. The idea is if you take the pawn on h3, then your king side is blown the f open. Something like rook h6 to g6 is going to be deadly. Instead of that, he goes g3, but now there's there's two problems here. One, this pawn is now an attacking piece. I mean, you can just see if the queen somehow gets access to that g2 square, that would be game over. And the other problem is Magnus Carlsen has the idea of sacrificing either the knight or the bishop on the g3 square. And if Magnus takes back, h takes g3, then this h-pawn has a clear path to go down the board and just promote. So that alpha 0 pawn on h3 is just a menace in the white position. Now, Magnus brings the final piece into the attack, knight d to f6. And Alexey goes bishop d3, trying to put pressure on the knight. But now on move 20, it is go time, baby. Magnus Carlsen sacks the knight and shit hits the fan. Here we go. Of course, I gotta mention the computer likes the bishop sacrifice a little bit more, but we're not gonna worry about that. The knight sacrifice is also excellent. Now h takes and bishop takes g3. Of course, the bishop hitting the queen and the bishop supported by black's queen. White cannot take it. Now queen e2 from Alexey. And here the key move is actually bishop f4, just retreating. The idea is if Alexey takes the bishop, then Magnus takes back with the queen, and the queen suddenly enters the game. And on the other hand, if Alexey denies that and just goes bishop d4, then knight to h5 is insane, and the knight is coming into the g3 square, where of course the threat is to fork the rook and the queen on e2 and f1. Okay, after queen e2, Magnus does not find bishop to f4. Instead, he goes knight to g4. This looks logical. You're just bringing the knight into the game. However, this is a mistake, maybe even a blunder, as now Alexey can take over the game with one move. And the winning move is knight takes a6. You're hitting the queen, and surprisingly, black does not have a forced checkmate here. I mean, it looks crazy with the queen, these minor pieces, the alpha 0 pawn and the rook all staring down at the white king. However, white's okay. Black has to go queen to e5, the best move, but then bishop b6. The bishop just runs out of the attack of the queen and the knight, and now the bishop actually defends this diagonal pretty well. And what is black supposed to do? In reality, the best move is simply h2 and then trading queens on e2, but here white has an edge. Wow. Okay, in the game, Alexey misses this idea of knight takes a6. That is not an easy move to find, especially in Title Tuesday against Magnus freaking Carlsen. So what does Magnus do here? Instead of that, the move is bishop d4 from Alexey, but this is a fatal mistake. Magnus Carlsen does not miss his chance, and he finds the key idea. By the way, if you like puzzles, pause the video right here. You deserve 5 Happy Meals if you can find this move. Did you find it? All right, time's up. The move from Magnus Carlsen is bishop f2 check. What's the idea? Well, there is simply no good way to take the bishop, and black's queen is coming in, threatening checkmate on this square here, g3. Okay, if Alexey takes the bishop with the queen, then Magnus just takes back the queen with the knight, and Magnus Carlsen wins. Instead, in the game, Alexey takes with the rook, but then queen g3 comes. Alexey has to go king to f1, and now the winning move on the spot is actually h2. However, Magnus Carlsen's move knight takes f2 is also good enough for a clear win. Now the queens come off the board and black gets a clear winning endgame. Now material is actually roughly level. I mean, Magnus has a rook and 2 pawns compared to the 2 minor pieces of Alexey Shirov. Yes, that is a little bit of an edge for Magnus, but the real kicker in this position is of course that alpha 0 pawn on the h3 square. And that is why this alpha 0 attack based on pushing the h-pawn down the board as white or as black is so dangerous. That h-pawn in so many variations actually becomes either A, an attacking piece, or B, after some of these pawns get traded off, it becomes a pawn threatening to promote on the h1 or h8 square. And from here, Magnus just presses, of course, he finds the incredible move in this position, that is h2. And then if Alexey takes the rook, Magnus promotes the pawn to a queen, completing the alpha 0 journey. Of course, Alexey does not take the rook, instead he goes king to f2. And from here, Magnus promotes the pawn to a queen, completing the journey, and the rest of this game is just child's play for Magnus. After a few more moves, Alexey Shirov has a losing endgame and he just resigns to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what an incredible attacking game, starting with the Najdorf Sicilian, then going for the H5 Alpha Zero attack, and then finally on move 20, sacrificing the knight when all the pieces are lined up against the white king. Now that was a beautiful attacking game by Magnus Carlsen. Now if you enjoyed this video and want to see more chess games analyzed by me, you can click right here to watch another video, or click right here to watch yet another video, and I'll see you in the next video.